Welcome to the dark side of true stories, where every whisper hides a secret and every silence has a scream. Subscribe now because here, the fear is real, and you never know who's listening. The hum of the EEG machine was a constant companion as I entered the dimly lit room, the only sound in a hospital that never truly sleeps. As a neurologist, I've spent countless hours monitoring patients in various stages of life and death. But sometimes, even after years of practice, something happens that challenges everything I've come to know. It was a late shifter on 3 a.m., and the hospital had a strange quietness to it, a hushed atmosphere that often brings an eerie calm to the otherwise sterile hallways. The kind of quiet that makes you start to wonder if the walls are watching you. I had just finished a round of consults in the neuro ICU where patients were hooked to life support, their bodies struggling against conditions beyond the reach of medicine. One particular case had been gnawing at me. Mrs. Clarkson, a 75-year-old woman with advanced Alzheimer's, had been unresponsive for days. Her brain had started to wither, the neurons dying slowly but surely, a fate I knew too well. As I stared at her EEG, I saw the usual pattern of flatline, punctuated only by occasional irregular blips. Her brain was already gone, or so I thought. But that night, something unusual caught my eye. The rhythm of the EEG, once barren, flickered a brief, steady spike. My tech, Karen, looked at me, her face pale. "Did you see that?" she asked in a hushed voice. I nodded, unable to speak. It wasn't just the abnormal activity that unsettled me. It was the timing. Mrs. Clarkson's vitals were slipping, blood pressure dropping, heart rate slowing on. Yet her brain seemed alive. "Do you think it's an artifact?" Karen asked, tapping the screen with a gloved finger. "It's not," I replied, though I was unsure. We both stared at the screen in silence for a moment, and then, as if some unseen force had triggered it, the pattern intensified. It became a rhythmic pulse, sharp and clear, like the beat of a heart. And then, without warning, the machine flatlined once again. The room grew cold. It wasn't just the temperature, it was as if something had passed through it, leaving behind a chilling emptiness. I should have left the room then. I should have called in the team, checked the patient again, but my curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't explain what I had just seen. The impulse to understand was too strong, like a thread pulling me deeper into the mystery of the human mind. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved in the corner of my eye, not in the patient's bed, but in the reflection of the glass panel across from us. I froze. Karen saw it too, her eyes wide, her breath catching. The figure was standing still, but I could tell it wasn't a nurse or a visitor. It was too dark, too indistinct, as though the reflection itself was a ghost. But there was no one there. Did you see that? Karen's voice trembled as she asked a question we both feared to answer. I didn't respond. My heart pounded in my chest, but my mind screamed at me to rationalize it. There was a logical explanation. Fatigue, a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was happening, something I wasn't ready to face. I told myself I was just seeing things, just exhaustion playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The following day, the world outside continued as usual. Nurses came and went. The machines hummed. Patients were transferred in and out of rooms. Life carried on, but I couldn't forget what I had seen, and neither could Karen. We talked about it during the morning rounds, but we kept the details vague. Neither of us could explain it, and the last thing I wanted was for people to think we were losing our grip on reality. 2 days later, I was back on the neuro floor for another late shift. I hadn't thought about Mrs. Clarkson much. She had passed the night after our strange encounter. The flat line on the machine had come too soon. I had chalked it up to the inevitability of her condition, but there was a part of me that wondered if something had been different, something unexplainable. That night, I received a call to consult on a new patient, David, a 42-year-old man who had been brought in after an apparent seizure. His family was frantic, but the EEG showed no significant abnormalities. He was awake and responsive, though he had no memory of what had happened. I sat with him for a while, talking through his history and asking about any unusual experiences. He hesitated, eyes darting to the door, then spoke in a low voice. "I saw someone in the hallway before the seizure. A figure, standing just outside the room." I felt a coldness creep down my spine as I asked him to describe it. He shook his head, as if unsure of how to put it into words. It wasn't real, I know, but it felt like it was. Something in his words struck me as unease. The same unease I had felt in Mrs. Clarkson's room, but I brushed it off, focusing on his medical history and symptoms. We ran more tests, though nothing abnormal appeared. He was discharged later that evening, but the image of the shadowy figure stayed with me. The connection between these events, Mrs. Clarkson's final moments, David's strange procedure vision felt too strong to ignore. But there was no evidence, no physical proof to explain it. Weeks passed and life in the hospital continued as it always did. Yet, the unease never left me. It lingered in the corners of my mind, gnawing at me. Then, during another overnight shift, it happened again. This time, it was a young woman named Sarah, who had been admitted for frequent seizures and strange neurological symptoms. Her EEG was normal, but she reported bizarre experiences, similar to David's visions of a shadowy figure, always present just beyond her peripheral vision. She was calm, matter-of-fact about it, as though she had come to accept this presence. When I asked her to describe it, she paused and said, "It's always watching me. It doesn't speak, it doesn't move, it just waits." My hands went cold as the weight of her words pressed on me. I excused myself, stepping out into the hallway to collect my thoughts. That's when I saw it across the hall, in the reflection of another window. The same figure, not distinct, not clearly human, but unmistakable. The feeling of being watched. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. No one had passed by. I called in the team, but when they arrived, there was nothing on the cameras. No sign of anyone, no explanation, but I knew what I had seen. And for the first time in my career, I couldn't explain it away. We dismissed it as fatigue. We moved on, as doctors do. But something in me had changed. The line between reality and the unknown had blurred. I started to wonder if the brain wasn't just a machine to be understood, but something more, something capable of seeing beyond what we could prove. It's been years since that night. I still work the late shifts, I still monitor patients, still pore over EEGs, but every now and then when the hospital is quiet, when the lights flicker just right, I'll see it again, the figure lurking just beyond the edges of the room, watching, waiting. And I wonder, more than anything, if it's the brain that's seeing it or if it's something else entirely. And I wonder if we'll ever truly understand what lies beyond the veil. The IG screen came back to life, the same rhythmic surges of electrical activity, pulsing faster now, almost as if in defiance of the body's natural decline. This time, it was more pronounced as I watched in disbelief. The bursts seemed to intensify, as if someone was trying to wake up, to force itself back into the world of the living. I turned to the nurse, who was now staring at the screen too, her face ashen. "What the hell is happening?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer, I couldn't explain it, and that terrified me. I had spent my entire career deciphering the brain, but what I was witnessing now, I couldn't even begin to comprehend. And then, without warning, the monitor fell silent. The surges stopped, and the line went flat for the last time. We both stood there in the oppressive quiet, unsure of how to process the moment that had just passed. It was the middle of the night when I returned to the EEG room. I sat in front of the monitor, trying to force myself to think logically. The screen before me was completely silent now, just the usual amplitude wave, but my mind kept drifting back to what I had seen in Mr. Fenton's room, to that strange electrical burst. It had felt different. I was about to leave when Lauren, who had just finished her shift, walked in. She looked exhausted, her eyes dark with sleeplessness. "Dr. Marsh," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if you remember, but I told you about that feeling I had when I worked the night shift last month. That thing I thought I saw," and my stomach turned. Lauren had never been one for superstitions. She was as grounded in science as I was. "I remember," I replied, my throat dry, "but this is different. We've been through too much tonight to be making assumptions." Lauren didn't respond right away. Instead, she walked to the window, glancing out at the city below before turning back to me. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "It's not just a feeling, Dr. Marsh. When I looked at Mr. Fenton's EEG, I saw something I can't explain. The same surges, the same pattern as before." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you saying?" Lauren hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "When I first saw them, I thought I was just tired, maybe imagining things. But when I looked closer, there was something there. It wasn't just a surge of activity. There was something else in the pattern, something that wasn't just neurological. And I think we saw it before he died. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, Lauren, but she cut me off. No, listen to me. I don't think Mr. Fenton was the only one in that room. I think something else was with him. The room grew colder, and for the first time, I wondered if she was right. I had spent my life looking at the brain, but had I been blind to what it was capable of? Or was there something we didn't understand about the mind that science would never explain? I left the hospital that night without any answers, only the cold, unsettling feeling that something had been watching, waiting, just beyond the edge of reason. But the question still lingers with me, long after the lights have gone out. What if the mind never truly lets go? What if, in those final moments, the brain isn't just shutting down, but reaching out? The hospital was quieter than usual that night. The usual bustle of nurses and doctors running from one room to the next had softened into a faint murmur, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I was in the neuro ICU reviewing a patient's latest EEG results, something that had become second nature to me after years in this field. But tonight, something was different. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was the strange sense of unease that seemed to hang in the air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. I'd been a neurologist for almost 15 years, and in all that time, I had seen it all: CTs, strokes, brain tumors, and degenerative diseases. But there were moments in our work that defied explanation. This was one of those moments. It started with a patient I had never met before, Mr. Fenton, a 63-year-old man who had been admitted for a severe stroke. His case was textbook: left-sided hemiplegia, slurred speech, and right-sided neglect. Yet, his EEG didn't match up. It wasn't abnormal in a clinical sense, but it was peculiar. The typical amplitude waves were interrupted by occasional bursts of activity, bursts that weren't typical of post-stroke changes. I sat in the EEG room, staring at the screen as the wavy lines flickered. The rhythm was odd, almost like it was struggling to establish a pattern. My technician, Lauren, who had been in the field for years, was staring at the screen with an expression I hadn't seen before. "Dr. Marsh," she said quietly, her voice shaky, "you need to look at this." I stood up and walked over to the monitor. The screen had transformed. The smooth, undisturbed lines had given way to sharp, synchronized spikes, high-frequency activity that was uncharacteristic of a stroke, the kind of pattern we only see during REM sleep or, more often, in patients who are deeply sedated. But Mr. Fenton wasn't asleep. He was awake, struggling to hold on to the remnants of his consciousness, his body still fighting for life. For a moment, I thought I might be mistaken. Maybe the system was malfunctioning. But as I leaned closer, the pattern changed again, becoming even more intense, an almost rhythmic surge, like a heartbeat that was too fast, too irregular to be real. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The screen returned to its usual flat, low-amplitude state. I glanced over at Lauren, who looked as pale as I felt. Neither of us spoke. We just stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what we had just witnessed. "It's probably an artifact," I muttered. But I knew we had both heard the unspoken question. What if it wasn't? I forced myself to focus on the medical side of things. I needed to stay grounded. There's a scientific explanation for everything, I told myself. It's just an anomaly. But the unease lingered, and the memory of that strange burst of electrical activity wouldn't leave my mind. Later that night, I went to check on Mr. Fenton in person, hoping the sight of him might help me make sense of the weirdness of the EEG. When I entered the room, the nurse at the station was already shaking her head. "Doctor, his vitals are dropping fast. He's unresponsive." I walked over to his bedside, my heart heavy with the inevitable. I looked at his monitor, watching the once steady line begin to wobble and fade. The numbers on the screen slowed, and soon his heartbeat stopped altogether. I stood there, staring at the man I had never truly met, but had worked so hard to save. But before I could officially call time of death, something happened. The monitor flickered. The night shift in neurology always felt different. It was as though the hospital transformed after hours, shedding its daytime bustle for a quieter, more sinister atmosphere. The lights dimmed in the hallways, and the hum of machines became the only company. I'd been a neurologist for over 18 years, yet I still couldn't shake the feeling that the dark hours brought with them an uncanny weight, as if the boundaries between life and death were thinner, more fragile, and perhaps even more malleable. And tonight, that feeling was stronger than ever. I was stationed in the neuro ICU, as I often was during these late shifts. My primary task tonight was to monitor the EEG of Mr. Holloway, a 72-year-old man who had been admitted following a massive stroke. He had survived the initial event, but was now unresponsive, tethered to life support, his brain activity fading slowly and steadily. His family had been told the prognosis was grim, and the doctors had already shifted to palliative care. But even in the bleakest cases, as a neurologist, I found myself endlessly studying the electrical activity of the brain, always seeking patterns, always searching for some sign that the mind was still present. At around 2:15 a.m., as I sat staring at his EEG, a sudden change caught my attention. The familiar amplitude waveforms, the static hum of his deteriorating brain, shifted. For a brief moment, there was a burst of activity, a surge of high-frequency spikes. It wasn't the kind of seizure activity I had expected, nor was it the kind of response that would be considered normal for someone in his condition. It wasn't an artifact, this was real. I squinted at the monitor, trying to make sense of it. The pattern wasn't random, it was too organized, too deliberate. Something's wrong, I muttered to myself. I stood up and called over Jennifer, the IG technician who had been working with me on this case. She stepped over to my side, her face tight with concern as she examined the screen. "Is that normal?" I asked, already knowing her answer. Jennifer looked at me, her brow furrowing. "No, that's not normal at all. That looks like REM sleep patterns, REM sleep, but he's awake, and his brain is in full-on failure mode." "No one has REM sleep in this state," I replied, my voice trailing off. I had seen countless EEGs over the years, but this was something different. We both stared at the screen as the surges continued for a few more seconds, before they began to subside. The room fell back into silence, save for the soft beeping of Mr. Holloway's monitors. Jennifer reached for the chart, her fingers trembling as she checked the latest vitals. "He's not supposed to be showing REM-like activity. His brain is practically shut down." I nodded, "I know." Suddenly, the room felt colder. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but the hallway was empty. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what we had just seen, but the sense of unease that settled over me couldn't be dismissed. I didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but in that moment, I couldn't help but wonder if there were things our science couldn't yet explain. I left the EEG room, trying to clear my mind, but the strange activity on the monitor kept haunting me. I returned to check on Mr. Holloway. His vitals were slowly fading, and his body seemed to be slipping further from consciousness. It wasn't long before he began to breathe more erratically, the rhythm of his chest becoming shallow. The monitor flatlined, and the silence in the room was deafening. It was over. Mr. Holloway had passed. I wasn't ready to leave yet, though. I couldn't explain why, but something about that final burst of activity on the EEG lingered in my thoughts. I had to know more. I returned to the EEG room, hoping that reanalyzing the data would give me some kind of clarity. But as I sat down in front of the monitor again, the screen flickered. The familiar low-amplitude waves returned, but there was something else there, too, a faint ghostly pattern just beneath the surface. I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of it, but before I could analyze it further, the lights above flickered. A low hum filled the room, and the temperature dropped by several degrees, making me shiver despite the warmth of my lab coat. I looked up at the door, half expecting someone to walk in, but the hallway outside remained dark and empty. My heart rate quickened as I turned back to the screen, my breath shallow. The faint pattern was growing stronger, the waves becoming more pronounced, like a heartbeat that refused to die. Suddenly, there was a voice, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. "Help me," the words echoed in my mind. I sat frozen, staring at the screen, unable to tear my gaze away. I wasn't too sure if I had heard the voice in the room, or if it was just the brain's electrical signals playing tricks on me. But that's the thing about neurology. Once you start to question what's real, it's hard to tell where the line between fact and perception begins to blur. Just then, I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. I snapped out of my trance, suddenly aware of how intensely my body was reacting. I rushed out of the EEG room and found myself standing in the corridor, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. I returned to the unit, my hands clammy, my heart pounding. I checked on the other patients, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled into my bones. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the unsettling memory of Mr. Holloway's final moments kept creeping into my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something that defied explanation, something that had crossed the line between the living and the dead. As I stood there, lost in thought, another nurse walked by, her face drawn with exhaustion. "Dr. Marsh, are you all right?" she asked, her voice quiet, concerned. I nodded, forcing a smile. I'm fine. Just, tired. But inside, I wasn't fine. My mind kept drifting back to the voice, the strange electrical activity, and the eerie cold that had taken over the room. Something had happened in that EEG room, something I couldn't explain. And for the first time in my career, I wondered if there were things out there that we, as scientists, would never be able to understand. As the night wore on, the sense of unease never left me. I finished my rounds, signed off on the charts, and headed for the door, my mind still reeling from what I had witnessed. But just before I stepped outside, I glanced back at the darkened halls of the Neuro ICU, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the reflection of the glass, the faint outline of a figure, standing still, watching. I didn't stop to look closer, I just walked away, the coldness of the room still hanging around me like a shadow. I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't believe in anything beyond what I could measure and see. But that night, I'm not so sure anymore. Something had crossed my path, and no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore the feeling that, perhaps, the brain holds more secrets than we will ever truly understand. The night shift at the hospital is when everything feels different. The bustling energy of the day fades into a quiet hum, almost like the world outside the building is holding its breath. But as a neurologist, I've always been attuned to the strange rhythms of the brain. And sometimes, during these late hours, I can feel the thin veil between life and death grow even thinner. Tonight I was assigned to cover the Neuro ICU, a unit that specializes in monitoring critically ill patients with neurological conditions. It was a quiet night, as these shifts tend to be, but I always felt a sense of unease when I was alone in the ICU at these hours. The only sounds in the room were the beeps of monitors and the soft shuffle of footsteps on the linoleum. My job was simple: monitor EEGs, track any unusual brain activity, and make sure nothing went wrong. But tonight, it wasn't that simple. I was reviewing the IG of a patient named Mr. Thompson, a 58-year-old man who had suffered a severe stroke several days ago. He had been comatose ever since, his brainwaves slow and erratic, a clear sign that his brain was struggling. His family had been told that he was unlikely to wake up, but tonight, as I watched his IG, something caught my eye. It wasn't the usual flat, low-frequency pattern you would expect from someone in a deep coma. Instead, there was a sudden spike, sharp, high-frequency waves that didn't make sense. It looked like the brain was in a state of vivid activity, but there was no indication that he was awake. This kind of electrical surge wasn't supposed to happen in a comatose patient. My heart began to race. I knew that strokes could sometimes lead to unusual brain activity, but this was different. I leaned closer to the monitor, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, ready to adjust the settings. But as I did, the spike disappeared as quickly as it had come. The screen returned to the usual amplitude waves. I frowned, trying to make sense of it. It must have been a glitch, I whispered to myself, but the doubt in my mind lingered. Suddenly, the room went colder. I looked up at the window, where the faint reflection of the dim hallway light flickered. I shook it off, blaming exhaustion for my paranoia. But then, just as I was about to turn back to the screen, I heard it. A soft, rasping sound, almost like a whisper. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Help me. It was so faint, I wasn't sure if I had really heard it. I glanced toward Mr. Thompson's bed. His eyes were closed, his face pale, but the strange feeling that something wasn't right weighed heavily on me. My rational mind told me it was just the stress of the job, but I couldn't ignore the creeping dread that settled in my chest. I turned back to the EEG, more determined than ever to find an explanation. I started to adjust the filters, rerun the readings, but everything seemed fine. That was, until another spike appeared on the screen. This one was even stronger than the last, and this time, the waves weren't just random, they were structured, synchronized, as though the brain was trying to tell me something. The room seemed to close in around me, the silence almost suffocating. I wanted to call for help, but something held me back. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the monitor. My hands trembled as I tried to steady the mouse, unsure of what I was seeing. The whispers came again, this time louder. Clearer, please. Help me. Don't leave me here. My skin prickled. This wasn't possible. The man was unconscious, locked away in his own mind, and yet, something was reaching out. Was it his brain, or was it something else? I felt my chest tighten. My mind raced for answers, trying to push away the impossible thought that clung to the edges of my consciousness. I glanced at the door to the ICU, half expecting someone to walk in, but no one did. The hallway remained empty. The whispers, however, didn't stop. They were coming from somewhere. inside the room. Without thinking, I stood up and approached Mr. Thompson's bed. His eyes remained shut, his breathing steady, but there was something in his expression that unsettled me. It was as if he was aware, even though he wasn't. His body was still, but his brain was alive with activity that shouldn't have been there. I leaned closer to him, unsure of what to say. The whispers echoed in my ears, and I felt a deep instinctual pull to do something. Anything. But I knew there was nothing I could do. The science told me that his brain was deteriorating, that he was beyond saving. But then, I saw something that stopped me cold. Mr. Thompson's hand twitched. It was subtle at first, a mere flicker of movement that could have been mistaken for nothing. But then, his fingers curled slightly, as though he was trying to reach out. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. It was impossible. He couldn't be conscious as brainwaves said otherwise. But as I watched, his hand twitched again, this time more deliberately. And then I saw it, a flicker of movement in his eyes, as if his eyelids were struggling to open. His pupils didn't move, but there was something there, something unmistakable. Doctor, a voice called from the doorway, and I snapped around, my heart racing. It was one of the nurses, standing in the dim light of the hallway, looking at me with concern. Is everything okay in there? I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say anything, Mr. Thompson's hand moved again, this time with more force. It was as if he were reaching out to me, trying to touch something, someone. The whispers, now desperate, filled the room. Don't leave me here, ... Please. I stood there, paralyzed. I knew what I was hearing was impossible. I knew that it couldn't be his voice, that it couldn't be real, but it felt real. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, in the air around me. It was as if the very space between us was vibrating with his desperation. The nurse, sensing something was wrong, stepped into the room and glanced at the monitor. Her eyes widened in shock. Doctor, his EEG, she began, but she didn't need to finish. I saw it too. The surges of electrical activity on the screen were growing more intense, more chaotic, but just as suddenly as it had started, the activity stopped. The monitor flatlined, and the whispers ceased. The room fell into an eerie, oppressive silence. The nurse and I exchanged a look, both unsure of what we had just witnessed. The sudden cessation of activity was too abrupt, too unnatural. We both knew what it meant, and neither of us spoke for a long time. As I stood there, staring at Mr. Thompson's lifeless body, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, something I couldn't explain. Something that the brain, with all its complexity, had hidden from science. And as I walked out of the ICU that night, I could still hear the faintest echo of those whispers in my ears. Don't leave me here. It haunted me for days after, and I knew, deep down, that I would never truly understand what had happened in that room. Not until the day I stopped looking for answers. The hum of the machines is almost comforting after hours of silence. You get used to it after a while, the beeping, the constant rhythm of life, the soft mechanical drone that fills the spaces between the inevitable. In neurology, we deal with the brain, the most intricate organ, the most mysterious. It's the source of everything we are, and yet, so much of it remains unexplained. But I've been a neurologist long enough to have learned one thing. The brain has its own rhythm, and sometimes, that rhythm can change in ways that don't make any sense. Tonight I was covering the night shift in the Epilepsy Monitoring Unit, or EMU, a place where we monitor patients who suffer from seizures, trying to locate the source in the brain or figure out what's triggering their episodes. It was supposed to be a quiet shift, a typical late-night rotation. The lights were dimmed, the constant shuffle of nurses' shoes against the floor was the only sound, and the steady beeping of the patients' monitors kept me company. As I reviewed the EEGs of the patients, it had been a long night already. I'd been making my rounds, checking in on patients, assessing EEGs, making sure everything was routine. But then I came across a troubling one. It was Emily, a 22-year-old woman who had been referred to us for unexplained seizures. She had no family history of epilepsy, no major head trauma, nothing to explain why she had suddenly begun experiencing violent, unprovoked seizures. Her EEGs had always been somewhat irregular. But tonight something stood out. There was a sudden, dramatic shift in her brainwave patterns. The familiar slow rhythms of her baseline were replaced by bursts of high-frequency activity. It wasn't the normal pattern we'd see in the middle of a seizure. It wasn't an epileptic event at all. It was something more organized, almost deliberate. I called in the IG tech Nick, who had been with me on several rotations. Nick, take a look at this. It's not right. He leaned in, his face scrunching in confusion. That's strange. It's like her brain is firing on all cylinders, but she's not having a seizure. What the hell is this? I ran my fingers over the control panel, trying to adjust the settings. Maybe it was just interference. Maybe it was nothing. But the readings didn't change. The bursts of high-frequency spikes came again, and this time they were even more pronounced. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice quiet but tensed. There was a low hum in the background, a noise that seemed to come from nowhere. It wasn't the machines. It wasn't the ventilation system. It felt as if it was coming from inside the room itself, almost like a vibration. Nick nodded, looking equally unsettled. "Yeah, it's like the room is alive." I forced myself to focus on Emily. She was asleep, completely unaware of the strange electrical activity coursing through her brain. Her vital signs were stable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Suddenly, her eyes flickered. At first, I thought it was nothing, just a twitch, a normal muscle contraction, but then her eyes opened slowly, deliberately, and they locked on mine. I froze. Emily had always been unconscious during these episodes. She hadn't been awake for any of the previous seizures, but now, she was staring right at me. "Emily?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Emily, can you hear me?" Her gaze didn't waver. She blinked once, and then her lips parted. "Who, are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible. I took a step back, my heart racing. "Emily, it's Dr. Morrison. Are you alright?" She didn't respond. Her eyes just continued to lock with mine, and the same surge of high-frequency brain activity appeared on the EEG again. This time, it was almost violent and intense, jarring series of spikes that seemed to pulse in time with her stare. Nick looked at me, his face pale. "What the hell is happening?" Before I could answer, the hum in the room grew louder. It filled the air, vibrating through my chest. It wasn't just the machines now. It felt like the very walls of the room were vibrating, like something was trying to push through. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went quiet again. Emily's eyes fluttered, and she slumped back into her pillow, completely still. I blinked, unsure of what had just occurred. I checked her EEG again. The strange activity had ceased. It was as if the entire room had been holding its breath, and had now released it. But the room felt wrong, off. I stepped away from her bed, running my hands over my face. I had to focus. This could be a simple neurological anomaly, some rare event, but everything in my gut told me something else was at play. Just as I was about to leave the room to get some fresh air and clear my head, I heard it again, a whisper. Soft, faint, but distinct. "Help me." My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, expecting to see Emily's eyes wide open again, but she was still asleep. Her body was completely still. I looked toward Nick, but he was already out of the room, his own nerves getting the better of him. I stepped closer to Emily's bed, almost against my better judgment. "Emily," I whispered, but she didn't stir. The whisper came again, louder this time, and it seemed to echo through the room. "Help me, please." I felt the coldness creep up my spine. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be, but I wasn't imagining it. The whispers, her whispers, were coming from somewhere, and they were real. I turned to leave the room, hoping to clear my head, but before I could make it to the door, I saw something. A shadow, hovering just beyond the bed, dark and unnatural. It flickered for a moment, like a trick of the light, but then it moved, a figure tall, indistinct, hovering at the foot of Emily's bed. My pulse quickened as I reached for the door handle, but the figure was already gone. The room was still, and the lights overhead flickered out of sync. I was about to leave when Emily's voice, weak but clear, echoed from her bed. "Don't go, he's coming." I froze. The whispering ceased, and in that moment, all the rational explanations, medical, neurological, psychological, slipped away. What was this? What was happening to her, to me? I left her room in a daze, unable to stop the chill that had settled deep within me. I glanced at the hallway, empty still, but as I passed the nurse's station, I overheard something that made my blood run cold. "There's a patient in room 303. Same symptoms, same whispers, I turned to face the nurse, but she wasn't there. The room was empty. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a case of seizures. It was something deeper, something darker. I didn't know what was happening to Emily, but I could unshake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something that couldn't be explained by science. The whispers, they were real, and they weren't just in Emily's head. The more I thought about it, the more I realized, there might be no way to escape them. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Every comment adds a new shadow to our haunted corner of the internet. Share this if you know someone who enjoys a good scare. More spine-chilling stories are coming soon, and remember, The scariest stories are the ones that could happen to you. Thanks for watching if you dare.